Hey guys, alright? Welcome everyone. The story begins in 1975, with a girl named Jim Gray. She is in the back seat of the car, complaining about the music her parents are listening to. Taking her irritation lightly, her mother says that she will be able to listen to whatever she wants once she gets her driver's license and drives her own car. Jim is upset with the response, and suddenly, the music changes to a more upbeat rhythm. Seeing that the radio changed stations by itself, her mother switches it back, but the phenomenon repeats. Jim swears she is not doing anything. Then the radio seems to go out of control, switching between stations frantically. The girl starts to get nervous with what appear to be voices in her head. When she screams at the voices to be quiet, the car skids and veers into oncoming traffic, colliding with a truck and flipping over. A kind of bubble forms around the girl, protecting her face from the shards of glass flying in all directions. Jim is hospitalized, and the doctors are astonished to find that she escaped completely unscathed. Unfortunately, the couple does not survive the accident, and the sad news is delivered to Jim by Professor Charles Xavier. When she asks what will happen to her now, he says he is responsible for a school that shelters children like her. Upon arriving at the institution, Jim says she cannot study there because everything is too beautiful, and she has a habit of breaking things. The professor assures her that he can help her with that and promises to fix everything she accidentally breaks. 17 years later, the United States launches the space shuttle Endeavour, and the astronauts on board begin to face problems. Xavier receives a call directly from the president asking for help with the situation. Then the team is gathered, and we see that Jim and her boyfriend Scott are included, along with Kurt, Peter, and Storm. The ones in charge of leading the mission are Raven and Hank. Scott expresses doubts about using the plane since the X-Jet was not designed for space travel. Before Hank can confess that he is also worried, Raven cuts off the conversation and begins to hurry the team. Speaking to her privately, Jim asks if the mission is safe. Knowing her power to read minds, Raven admits she is not as confident as she wanted to seem but promises to abort the mission at the first sign of danger. In the news, it is already being reported that the US government has asked for help from the famous mutants. As the X-Jet takes off, Xavier talks with NASA specialists about the situation. The Endeavour's systems short-circuited as they approached solar flares, and now the astronauts are without communication or control of their own trajectory. Upon reaching the coordinates, the team sees that the Endeavour is spinning on its axis at a concerning speed. Furthermore, Raven is not sure if what lies ahead is indeed a solar flare. Scott is the first to use his powers, firing an energy beam that slows down the spin. Kurt teleports inside the Endeavour with Peter while Storm seals the external ruptures. Peter uses his speed to gather the astronauts, and Kurt teleports them all to the X-Jet. When Raven is ready to return, one of the astronauts warns that the commander was in another cabin and was not rescued. However, the Endeavour is now almost being engulfed by the mass of energy, and Raven refuses to risk the students. Xavier intervenes, saying they cannot leave anyone behind. He suggests that Jim use her powers to hold the entire ship during the rescue. She says she can, but not from that distance. Raven calculates that they have only 30 seconds. Kurt takes Jim to the other ship and searches for the commander while she holds the entire structure by herself. When the countdown ends, the Endeavour is hit, and Kurt returns with the commander, but fails to bring Jim back in time. The unknown energy is coursing through her body as she realizes that the immense cloud is about to engulf the X-Jet as well. Gathering all her strength, she manages to redirect that mass toward herself and absorbs all the energy at once. Everyone watches in disbelief until the phenomenon ends, and the only thing left is Jim's body floating in space. Kurt brings his friend back, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief when she opens her eyes. A crowd awaits the heroes on the runway, and the celebration continues when they arrive at the school. But Raven's mood is not festive at all when she enters Xavier's office, furious about the high-risk nature of the recent missions. She accuses the professor of putting the students in danger to win medals and appear on magazine covers. Xavier justifies his decisions with the tragic past of mutants, who have always been harshly persecuted. He admits that he has risked his kind to save humans but reminds her that there is no middle ground and that as soon as they cease to be heroes, they will return to being villains. In the infirmary, Hank tells Jim that her tests are normal except for the genetic part. According to the report, the experience strengthened Jim, and her power level exceeded the limits of all scales. He explains that this shouldn't happen and can only be a machine error. Released to rest, she finds her boyfriend and tells him that she feels much better than before, as if everything around her is amplified. That night, Margaret Smith is having dinner with friends when a constant barking begins to annoy her, and she asks to be excused. Her dog is fixated on the dark area between the trees, and Margaret understands why when she gets closer. Several extraterrestrial beings are walking silently through the woods. One of them takes Margaret's form and returns to the dining room with an apathetic expression that frightens the guests. Margaret's husband comes to ask what happened, and she attacks him, while her friends begin to scream. At Xavier's mansion, the students are having fun at an outdoor party. Hank and Raven keep an eye on them while discussing the future of mutants. Hank still trusts Professor Xavier, but Raven feels she exchanged one form of oppression for another. At the party, Scott says that Jim is famous, and the kids have started calling her Phoenix. The two are getting close to a campfire at that very moment, and she suddenly begins to feel overwhelmed. Raven notices that something is wrong when one of the monitors starts beeping. Jim becomes very anxious and lets out a scream, sweeping the school with a powerful wave of energy before fainting. Xavier is at a fancy event with the elite of society when he feels the anomaly. Rushing back to the institute, he finds Jim unconscious and cannot see her mind as usual. Using a powerful device called Cerebro, he amplifies his own powers to access Jim's mind. Xavier explains that he made some adjustments when she joined the school, raising mental walls to protect her from trauma. Now it seems that her experience in space affected those walls, and they are collapsing. The three then hear a male voice, and Xavier is very surprised. Jim wakes up, saying she heard her father's voice and now knows he is alive. Xavier tries to convince her it is a hallucination, but she can feel he is lying and expels him from her mind, causing the professor to faint. Jim tells her boyfriend that she needs to visit her father and, furthermore, it is not safe for him to be near her now. Scott does not want her to go and says he would rather take the risk, but she knocks him unconscious with a touch on the nape of his neck. He tells Xavier everything as soon as he wakes up, and the professor decides to go find her, predicting that the meeting with her father will not be very positive. Meanwhile, the false Margaret is meeting with other imposters. Her real name is Vuk, and these are the Dbari, an alien race that escaped destruction. They want to seize the energy that Jim absorbed to rebuild their empire. The next day, Jim returns to her hometown and visits John Gray, her father. Also on the way there, Raven expresses her disapproval to Xavier, saying that he did not have the right to lie to Jim, let alone interfere with her mental processes. Meanwhile, the family reunion is already going off the rails. Jim notices that there are no pictures of her in her father's house and asks why he never tried to find her. Reading her mind, she discovers that her entry into the special school was already decided before she ever met Xavier, as the professor had worked everything out with John first. Faced with her furious hurt, John cruelly invites her to delve even deeper into her mind and witness what she did to her own parents. We see the accident scene again, but this time it becomes clear that the girl caused her mother to faint. Jim is devastated by the revelation, and her father is scared when the house begins to shake, but she explains that it is just her friends arriving. Jim storms out into the street, furious, confronting Xavier about all his lies. Scott tries to talk to her, but the police cars are already arriving, and Jim's power is about to go out of control. Irritated by the sirens, she sends the cars flying with a gesture and begins to levitate. Kurt goes to get her, and they both crash onto the roof, destroying the interior of the house in a very quick struggle where he escapes from her blows with teleportation. Blowing the front of the house apart, she makes everything move in slow motion. Both the projectiles and the lightning from Storm freeze in the air, and only Peter can move normally as he is using his maximum speed. Jim removes the debris he is leaning against to reach her and causes him to take a nasty fall. When it becomes clear that she can dodge anything, Xavier freezes the police and all the mutants except Raven, as the only chance now is dialogue. The strategy starts off well, and Jim seems to calm down, but she stays firm and asks everyone to step back so no one gets hurt. Raven says she will never step back nor leave her behind, because that is the true meaning of family. Overwhelmed with emotions, Jim explodes again, inadvertently throwing Raven away. Her body is pierced by wooden slats as she falls. Horrified again with herself, Jim flies away while the others try to help Raven but are unsuccessful. At the school, the kids have already heard the news and seem to be afraid of Jim. Scott tells them that it was not on purpose and that Jim is still a beloved person who needs help. But Storm doesn't quite agree and says he is trying to ignore that his girlfriend is no longer the same person. Hank is completely devastated and blames Xavier for Raven's loss. He says that only she was seeing the truth and ended up paying for the professor's mistakes. John Gray receives a visit from 2 FBI agents, who are actually the aliens in disguise. Vuk wants to know everything about Jim, and when John stops cooperating, finding the duo a bit strange, she changes tactics and the screaming begins. After a few aimless days, Jim goes to the island of Genosha, where the refugee mutants live, and asks Eric, also known as Magneto, for help. She believes it will be easier to learn to control herself with someone who has hurt many people, just like herself. Eric does not promise anything before knowing exactly what happened, but their conversation is interrupted by 2 American Army helicopters that come looking for Jim. With a defensive attitude, Eric says he has not seen her and makes it clear that he does not like this kind of unexpected visit. But then the blades of one of the helicopters begin to move on their own, and he realizes that Jim is trying to destroy it. He uses his gifts to try to contain her, but seeing the extent of her power, he prefers to save the soldiers. After Jim destroys one of the helicopters, causing enormous destruction in the village, she tries to bring down the other one when all the soldiers have already boarded. Only by using all his strength can Eric stop her. Shocked by Jim's coldness, he orders her to leave the island immediately. The incident appears in the news as the second catastrophe related to the mutant Jim Gray. Xavier is disappointed to hear that the government is already planning a containment plan for all mutants demonstrating very intense powers. He calls the president and finds out that this line will soon be disconnected. Meanwhile, in New York, an elderly gentleman is drinking at the bar when Jim's photo appears on TV, encouraging the public to turn her in to the authorities if they see her. When Vuk sits at the counter and greets Jim, we see that she is the one sitting there, controlling the minds of everyone to see an elderly man in her place. The trick does not work with Vuk because her mind is not like that of Earthlings. As the two talk, Hank leaves the mansion without telling anyone and goes to Eric, asking for his help in finding Jim. He says it is what Raven would want them to do, but soon realizes the blunder. Eric did not yet know that Raven had died, and the news deeply shakes him. Vuk takes Jim to a luxurious residence under the control of the Dbari. She says that no one fears her here, but one of her allies whispers to the others that everything must be ready. If the guest cannot control her power, it will be necessary to destroy it. Upstairs, Vuk transforms one of the rooms into a realistic simulation of outer space. She says that the power absorbed by Jim came from the oldest cosmic energy, the same one that destroyed her planet. The Dbari have been following her since then, hoping to control her power, but the energy cloud disintegrates everything it touches, with the only exception of Jim. Her mistake was wanting to contain such immense power instead of channeling it into grand things, even creating new worlds. Meanwhile, Eric is putting on the helmet he had retired, determined to avenge Raven, and Xavier already knows he is involved. The mutants decide to go to New York and prevent the tragedy. Hank and Eric are ready for the attack when they arrive. Xavier still tries to engage in dialogue, but Eric is blinded by rage. Hank is in his beast form and charges down the busy street, causing chaos. Eric intends to levitate to Jim, but he will have to dodge Scott. The young mutant approaches Magneto, but his powers do not reach the strongest. The companions of each leader begin to fight among themselves, and we barely see Kurt because he keeps switching people's places, having to save several at the same time. Cornered by Eric's allies, Storm breaks free with a powerful whirlwind, right atop a bus full of terrified tourists. Xavier tries to minimize the damage by destabilizing the opponents with his mental power, but Eric has much more impressive tricks. He unearths a subway car, opening a huge crater in the middle of the avenue. He then enters the building and uses the car to block the entrance. With Vuk's support, Jim is already ready to defend herself. Eric levitates to her and releases the metal from the handrail, transforming it into a spear. The sharp tip comes dangerously close to her eye, but then it falls and shatters on the floor. It becomes clear that Jim let the spear get that close just for show, as she is 100% in control. Raising one of her hands, Jim squeezes the air between them, and the movement is reflected in the metal helmet, which begins to crush Eric's head. The metal breaks, and she throws the opponent out the window. Seeing that the destruction is out of control, Xavier asks Kurt to take him inside and begins to talk to Jim. He tells her that she can control herself because she is capable of anything. Mocking this statement, she proves it to be true, forcing the professor to stand and walk while crushing his wheelchair. When the two are face to face, Xavier says that he no longer has access to her mind, but she can still enter his, and then he begs her to do so. Jim becomes emotional, reliving the few good moments of her childhood, and also watches the rest of the conversation between Xavier and her father. John tells him that the girl is beyond hope, but the professor insists that there is always hope. Even now, suffering horrific pain, he tells her that it is not too late. Then the fiery glow in Jim's eyes fades, and she releases him. Vuk realizes she is losing ground and says that all of this is just the past and that she needs to think about the future. Jim says she does not want this power and tells Vuk she can take it if she wants. The alien accepts the offer, and the process begins. The cosmic energy envelopes the embrace of the two as the power is transferred from one to the other. Xavier realizes that Jim will not survive the transfer and begs them to stop, but Vuk responds that human lives mean nothing. Revealing her true intentions, she says that this world will belong to her and her race will destroy all humans. Desperate, Xavier begins to speak to Jim, pleading with her to try to break free, but she is still in a trance. At that moment, Scott manages to enter the building and hits Vuk with a blast, interrupting the process. Outside, the army has just arrived with specialized weapons for fighting mutants. Hank and Storm are forced to wear collars that neutralize their powers. Kurt is next, and it doesn't take long before all the mutants are captured. In the back alley, Vuk recovers from the fall and sees that she managed to retain a portion of the powers. The mutants are taken to a train destined for a special prison. Xavier apologizes to Hank and admits he was wrong about everything. He says that this new power of Jim modifies her personality, but swears that the real Jim is still inside there, insisting that it is worth fighting to save her. He also tells about Vuk and warns that she will not give up easily. At the same time, several Bari are crawling along the walls of the tunnel and waiting. Inside the train, the mutants hear loud banging on the roof, not realizing that it is the aliens jumping onto the train. The helicopter pilot gets a huge scare when he sees those people walking on the roof of the train and warns the soldiers on board. They think the invaders are other mutants trying to free the prisoners and do not believe Eric and Xavier's warnings when they say that the threat is much greater. When the Bari enter the car, nothing seems to have any effect against them. The shots only manage to wound them superficially, and still, they regenerate in moments. Even those still balancing on the train roof manage to take down the helicopters simply by throwing objects. The invaders reach the second-to-last car quickly and begin to charge against the door, while the prisoners continue pleading for someone to free them, promising to help in the fight. When the door gives in, the soldiers are completely massacred. One soldier, seeing he has no choice, releases the mutants. Now the real fight begins, and the two groups of opposing mutants set aside their differences to defeat their common enemy. Scott blows apart the door leading to the last car and carries Xavier there while Storm electrocutes the Bari from the roof, and Eric uses parts of the train to attack them. Kurt becomes enraged when the last soldier dies, for he was the one who said that his son was a fan of the mutants. Instead of continuing to save people with teleportation, he starts using his power to attack, taking one of the enemies onto the tracks just seconds before the train passes. Eric fights some aliens without difficulty but soon finds himself surrounded by more of them. Fortunately, Storm helps him with a strong whirlwind, sending several of them to the back car. Seeing that there are only enemies inside it, Eric clenches his fist and, with that, crushes the entire car. Unfortunately, the group still hasn't faced the most powerful alien, as Vuk now jumps from the bridge, crushing Hank in the same motion. Storm's lightning does not seem to affect her, and she even manages to redirect it to defeat her opponent. Another helicopter arrives to combat the aliens, but one of them just runs and jumps from the train, punching the pilot through the glass. Now, Vuk is face to face with Eric, and he is the first person she deigns to speak to. She reminds him that he himself wanted to take revenge on Jim just hours ago, but Eric says he has changed his mind. He points all the weapons at Vuk and starts shooting continuously, but this doesn't even slow her down. Moving her hand as if swatting away a mosquito, she throws Eric violently against the wall. Not even Scott's beam can stop her. In the last car, Xavier manages to communicate with Jim through telepathy. She tells him that she forgives him for everything he did and understands that he only wanted to give her a family. When Vuk arrives, Jim tells Xavier that she is going to protect her family. Her body levitates out of the shackles as she opens her eyes. Smashing Vuk out of the train, Jim lifts all the cars into the air, protecting the mutants inside with bubbles. None of them are hurt even as the cars crash down. The aliens also survive, but they run towards her and are immediately disintegrated. Even when one of them manages to hit her, the spear also disintegrates, and the wound closes up. When only Vuk remains, she grabs Jim by the neck in an attempt to suck the rest of her power. The cosmic energy grows around them and begins to threaten everyone nearby. Then Jim takes her enemy into space and allows the energy to consume them both. From the ground, the mutants watch the final explosion, which forms the silhouette of an immense phoenix in the sky. Sometime later, we see that Xavier's school has been renamed to honor Jim Gray, and now Hank is the new director. Retired, Xavier tries to enjoy an afternoon alone at a French bistro, but Eric finds him, wanting to play chess. He says he hasn't forgotten when Xavier gave him a home, and now it's his turn to welcome the professor. The film ends with the spirit of the phoenix hovering over the earth.